Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. An Egyptian court has sentenced 3 Al Jazeera journalists to between 7 and 10 years in prison. Peter Gresti, Mohammed Fahmy, and Bahar Mohammed were convicted on terrorism charges. These include spreading false news in support of the Muslim Brotherhood, deemed by the government a terrorist group. The 3 have been jailed since December in a case that stoked international outrage. In a statement, Al Jazeera said the verdict defied, quote, logic, sense, and any semblance of justice. As the sentence was read today, one of the 3 journalists, Mohammed Fahmy, yelled out, quote, "Where's John Kerry?" a reference to the Secretary of State's surprise visit to Egypt just one day before. Kerry was in Cairo to help restore U.S. ties with the Egyptian government nearly 1 year after a military coup. Kerry held talks with the new president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the former Egyptian general who led the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi last July. The Obama administration partially suspended aid to Egypt, but has avoided a full cutoff by refusing to deem Morsi's ouster a coup. At a news conference in Cairo, Kerry said he expects a full resumption of U.S. military aid in the coming months, beginning with around $575 million already released in the last 10 days. Kerry said Egypt will soon receive a long-delayed shipment of military helicopters.
Those Apaches are focused on the issue of terrorism, and they will be used in a place where Egypt has been working very, very hard in concert with Israel and others and with us in order to push back against these terrorist activities.
Kerry spoke one day after Egyptian forces broke up a march against an anti-protest law that bars unsanctioned demonstrations. Dozens of people were arrested as police used tear gas to disperse the crowd. Solidarity rallies were also held in 8 cities worldwide. Kerry is the highest-level U.S. official to visit Egypt since Morsi's ouster last July. Kerry said he raised the Al Jazeera journalist case with Sisi and also the mass trials that have brought death sentences for hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood supporters. On Saturday, an Egyptian court confirmed the death sentences of nearly 200 prisoners, including the Brotherhood's general guide, Mohammed Badi. We'll have more on Egypt after headlines. Following his visit to Egypt, Secretary of State John Kerry is in Baghdad today for talks with the embattled Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and other political leaders. Ahead of his arrival, Kerry signaled the Obama administration's prepared to drop support for Maliki, calling for leadership prepared to represent all of Iraq.
We will help Iraqis to complete this transition if they choose it. If they want, they have an opportunity to choose leadership that can represent all of Iraq, a unity government that brings people together and focus on ISIL. And I am convinced that they will do so, not just with our help, but with the help of almost every country in the region, as well as others in the world, who will always stand up against the tyranny of this kind of terrorist activity.
Kerry's comments follow reports the White House has conditioned military support for the Iraqi government on Maliki's resignation. Kerry's visit to Baghdad comes as Sunni militants with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria have captured more territory. Over the weekend, ISIS militants seized 3 border crossings with Syria and Jordan, as well as 4 nearby towns. An Iraqi government airstrike, meanwhile, has reportedly killed at least 7 civilians and wounded 12 others in the ISIS-held Tikrit. Residents say Army helicopters fired on civilian cars lined up at a gas station. The Iraqi government is claiming it only killed insurgents. We'll have more on Iraq later in the broadcast. Israeli forces have killed 2 more Palestinians in a continued crackdown over the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teenagers. 2 Palestinians were shot dead Sunday, including one man in Nablus who'd allegedly thrown rocks at Israeli troops. Demonstrators also confronted Palestinian Authority forces in Ramallah, asking them for protection against Israeli raids. At least 4 Palestinians have been killed and 330 have been detained since the teens were kidnapped earlier this month while hitchhiking from a Jewish settlement. No group has claimed responsibility, but the Israeli government has blamed Hamas. Meanwhile, here in the U.S., activists are hailing what's being called a major milestone for the global campaign to boycott and divest from Israel over its treatment of Palestinians. At its General Convention Friday, the Presbyterian Church of the U.S. voted to divest from 3 companies it says supply Israel with equipment used in the occupation of Palestinian land. The companies are Motorola Solutions, Caterpillar, and Hewlett-Packard. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. New figures show the number of refugees is at its highest level since after World War II. The UN says over 51 million people are displaced worldwide, half of them children. UN High Commissioner for Refugees Antonio Guterres unveiled the figures Friday.
If we have, for the first time since the Second World War, more than 50 million people displaced by war or by persecution, it's because we are witnessing a multiplication of new conflicts in the world. And the global conflict generates global displacement. And at the same time, old conflicts seem never to die.
Syrians accounted for the bulk of the world's 2.5 million new refugees last year. The Obama administration's responding to the surge in child migrants with increased detention and speedier deportations. Thousands of children are being held in U.S. detention centers after fleeing violence and poverty in Central America. The New York Times reports the White House plans to open additional detention facilities and fast-track immigration trials to allow for quicker deportation. Tracking devices such as ankle bracelets will be deployed more widely to monitor immigrants set to be deported. Immigration officers and judges will be assigned on an emergency basis to the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, where most of the crossings happen. More than 47,000 unaccompanied children have been caught at the U.S. border since October. On Friday, Vice President Joe Biden met with leaders from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to discuss the migrant crisis. Biden unveiled new funding of $255 million for repatriation programs and efforts to tackle gang violence in Central America. The freed American prisoner of war, Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, has been released from a military hospital to begin outpatient care. The Army says Bergdahl has been transferred to a military base in Texas, where he'll continue his recovery from 5 years in Taliban captivity. Hundreds of people rallied in Albuquerque, New Mexico Saturday to protest a spate of deadly police shootings. Demonstrators marched through the streets carrying fake tombstones bearing the names of 26 people shot dead by police since 2010. A recent Justice Department report found a pattern of excessive force in those killings. Federally mandated reforms are expected in the coming weeks. Activists in Detroit have appealed to the United Nations over the city's move to shut off the water of thousands of residents. The Detroit Water Authority says it has over 323,000 delinquent accounts. It's begun turning off the taps of those who don't pay bills that total above $150 or that are 60 days late. The Detroit Water Authority carries an estimated $5 billion in debt and has been the subject of privatization talks. In a submission to the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, activists say Detroit is trying to push through a private takeover of its water system at the expense of basic rights. The group Food and Water Watch said, quote, "By denying water service to thousands, Detroit is violating the human right to water." A man who allegedly threatened to kill the head of the Council on American-Islamic Relations has been arrested in New York. CARE, the largest Muslim civil rights group in the United States, says Bernard Laufer sent death threats to Director Nahad Awad and other staff. Laufer was charged with attempted murder last year for allegedly stabbing a Muslim at a New York mosque. CARE said, quote, "This is yet another incident demonstrating the actual imminent harm that can result from Islamophobia." And an Episcopal chaplain has made history as the first transgender priest to preach at the historic National Cathedral in Washington. Reverend Dr. Cameron Partridge delivered a sermon as part of events marking LGBT Pride Month.
I'm moved by how our decisions are calling us into a deeper awareness of the mystery of the human person. For at the end of the day, to respect the dignity of every human being, as we promise in our baptismal covenant, is to actively create space for the unfolding of our lifelong growth as members of Christ's body, whoever we may be.
The Reverend Dr. Cameron Partridge, the first openly transgender priest to preach at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.